Hello, and welcome to the Crisis Point podcast. I'm Eric Sammons, your host and the editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine. Today, I'm going to do a solo podcast because I want to talk about a recent document that Pope Francis put out, his Motu Proprio Antiquum Ministerium. Don't come to me for Latin pronunciation guide, by the way. And the purpose of this apostolic letter is instituting the ministry of catechist. So I wanted to talk about that today. What does this mean? How does it impact parishes? How does it impact us as Catholics? Before I get into that, though, be sure that you like and subscribe to this channel. We've gotten a lot of new people subscribing to the channel. I really appreciate that over the past month or so. Hopefully we can continue to put out some great content. I know next week we're going to have a great guest. I'm not going to say who it is, but everybody knows who he is. And so that's going to be great to have him on. Okay, so let's talk about this Motu Proprio. So the purpose of it, the Pope says, is to institute the ministry of catechist. Now, before we really talk about what this says, I think the biggest point of discussion here is, what does it mean to be a minister? What does ministry mean in the Catholic context? We use this phrase, this term, a lot in the Catholic world, but it has different meanings. It also sounds to a lot of Catholics like a very Protestant sounding word. Obviously when I was a Protestant, was Methodist, we talked about our minister. We obviously didn't have a priest. We had a minister. And so sometimes people think if you use the word ministry or minister, you're automatically sounding Protestant. But that's not really true. There really is a true meaning, a usage of the term minister in the Catholic world. Now, traditionally, that's always been the ordained ministry. That's what ministry primarily refers to, as the ordained ministry. Obviously, that would be the bishop, priest, deacon. In the old days, it would be the different orders of the clergy as well. For example, the porter, the acolyte, the lector, things of that nature. And that's what it has always meant traditionally, the word ministry. A lay person wasn't really a minister. And I know that so many Catholics talk about lay ministers all the time now, but that's a new innovation. It wasn't really something used before. In fact, I know a bishop who he couldn't stand the term minister when it was used outside of the ordained ministry. He always wanted us to call it apostolates. And I think he was right. I think he had a good instinct that lay people can have apostolates, but only a ordained man can have a ministry as an ordained minister. Now, what Pope Francis is doing in this Motu Proprio is he's instituting the ministry of catechist. So he's establishing a new ministry in the church. Now, is that ordained or not? No, it's not ordained, but it's going to have its own right, RITE, to establish somebody in the ministry of catechist. And so it has a sort of pseudo-ordained feel to it, for lack of a better term, because it's going to be regulated by the bishop. It's going to include formal training, and it's going to, like I said, it's going to have a formal right of institution. So in a lot of ways, it sounds like somebody becoming a deacon, right? Or somebody becoming a priest. It's very similar. And so it has this formal procedure, become a minister of catechetics. Now, what I want to do I'm going to talk about that some more at the end about what that means, but I want to kind of go through the document a little bit here to give some of the highlights of some of the, I'll be honest, troubling aspects of this document, which just dropped a few days ago, and without a lot of fanfare, but it really is, I think it is a big deal. At the beginning, Pope Francis says the ministry of catechist in the church is an ancient one. And he talks about that there are examples already present in the New Testament. And then he quotes from St. Paul, where he says, some people God has designated in the church to be first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then mighty deeds, then gifts of healing, assistance, administration, and varieties of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all do mighty work, deeds? Do all have gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? Strive eagerly for the greatest spiritual gifts, but I shall show you a still more excellent way. And so what Francis is trying to say here, look, they're talking about these different ministries in the church, including teachers, which would be catechists. And it comes right after apostles, prophets, and other things. The problem, of course, is not all these are ministries in the sense that I think any of us would say today. For example, is it a ministry to do mighty deeds? Is it a ministry to be a prophet? Is it a ministry to have gifts of healing, to speak in tongues? These things are they ministries? So I don't think it really works to say that because St. Paul is talking about these different, what different people do in the church, to say they're all now somehow ministries, or that therefore catechetics should be a formal ministry in the church. Now, going on a little bit further, one of the issues, yes, there was a sigh there for those who are listening closely. One of the issues we have here is, of course, the big debate in the church over the past decades, however many decades, has, of course, been the restriction of the ordained ministry to men only. So only men can become bishops, priests, and deacons, can be ordained. That's the perennial teaching of the church. Never, there is no evidence it's ever not been the case. And John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, he definitively declared that to be the case as well in the 1990s. But of course, there's still been a push to have women as ordained ministers. And it's done through various small steps. So for example, altar girls is one example. There's a push now, of course, having women at the altar to be lectors, extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, all these different things, having women kind of creep into the sanctuary and become part of the ordained ministry. And you see it also in the push for women deacons that is happening in some parts of the church. Well, what happens here is now we're adding another ministry, another formal ministry of church. Yes, it's not ordained, but where both men and women can do it. And so it's, again, blurring the line between ministry and apostolate, like lay ministry, lay apostolate, ordained ministry, between men and women. If women can be lay ministers of catechesis, why can't they be ordained ministers? So we see the subtle degradation of the all-male priesthood, the all-male clergy. And we see that he talks about in paragraph 3, Pope Francis says, "Nor can we forget the countless lay men and women who directly took part in the spread of the gospel through catechetical instruction. Men and women of deep faith, authentic witnesses of holiness, who in some cases were also founders of churches and eventually died as martyrs." Wait, hold on. He says, men and women of deep faith, authentic witnesses of holiness, who in some cases were also founders of churches? What women have ever been considered a founder of a church? And just to be clear here, what I think he's talking about here, founders of churches. For example, it's always been considered that Peter and Paul were the founders of the Church of Rome, because they established that church by their blood. Obviously, Peter being the first pope, but Paul as well died in Rome. And in the ancient church, the different churches, meaning churches in cities, for example, in Ephesus or Alexandria or something like that, they always had founders. So, for example, Mark was considered a founder of Alexandria. Apostle Peter, founder of the church in Antioch. I believe John would be the founder of the church in Ephesus. St. Thomas, the founder of a church over in India. They were considered founders of these churches, and often these churches took great pride in who their apostolic founder was. There's no evidence of a woman ever being a founder of a church, because the whole point of a founder of a church is they were somebody in the ordained ministry. They were a bishop or an apostle. That's how they were the founder of the church. So a woman couldn't be a founder of a church. So again, we have this confusion in this statement that again blurs the line between men and women, blurs the line between ordained ministry and non-ordained ministry, because maybe you could claim, well, a woman founded a church, but she wasn't an ordained minister. Oh, okay. Again, we're causing confusion by these statements. And so I think that's one of the big issues I have with this Motu Proprio is, by establishing this ministry of catechesis, there's certain things in the Motu Proprio itself, the apostolic letter, that push towards this idea of there's no difference between men and women when it comes to ministry. And that's simply not the perennial teaching of the church. The church has always shown that there is a role for men and a role for women that is different. Obviously, for example, the highest role any human person has ever had in the church is that of the Blessed Virgin Mary, a woman. So it's again, and so it's not a matter of competition either. Like, oh, men have the better roles or something like that. No, men and women have different roles, but this activity of creating more ministries that women can be part of and claiming somehow that they're founders of churches, it just blurs that line and causes more confusion. Okay, so next we have in paragraph 4, we have this statement where it says, beginning with the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, the church has come to a renewed appreciation of the importance of lay involvement in the work of evangelization. And here we have what we see in almost every ecclesial document, every Vatican document, every papal document, is this clear in practice break in tradition between before the Second Vatican Council and after the Second Vatican Council. It's the hermeneutic of rupture that has been talked about before, but you see it in this document everywhere. And there's this idea that somehow after Vatican II, there was this whole renewal, and I'll talk in a minute about all these new things that happen. But I heard somebody who was talking about this say that after Vatican II, there's been such a greater appreciation and a flourishing of catechesis in the church. Well, if catechesis is educating people in the faith so they know their faith better, it's hard to say that catechesis is flourishing in the church today when 70% of Catholics don't believe in the real presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. And I'm sure before Vatican II, that number was a lot lower. And so if you're looking at results, which I think would matter, catechesis has actually been abysmal. And I think I think most people really do understand that, who have been involved in different parish work and seen what's happened, that catechesis has been terrible. That's not to say there aren't cases of good catechesis happening at parishes, even today, today and in the past. But the fact of the matter is the vast majority of people who grow up Catholic are woefully catechized. They know almost nothing about their faith. And so the idea that somehow there's been this renewal of catechesis after Vatican II is just ridiculous. But more importantly, for in this document, again, it's this idea that after Vatican II is all that matters. Every single reference in this short document is from Vatican II or later, except for references to Scripture. A lot of them, of course, are references to Pope Francis himself. He has a fondness for self-referential referentialism, I guess you'd call it. But what it does is it really does have this idea of a break, that it's almost like this the Mormon idea that there was a falling away, the great apostasy that happened sometime after the last apostle died, and then all of a sudden Joseph Smith brought it all back in the 1820s, 1830s in Mormonism. You see the same thing in practice here, that reference Scripture, reference St. Paul, talk about the early church, but then all of a sudden there's no reference at all until somehow it was all brought back with the Second Vatican Council. And of course, I've written about this before. I'm not going to go on a big Vatican II rant here, but it's more a matter of, even if you're a big pro-Vatican II person, I think you would have to agree that as Catholics, we should look to the whole tradition. For example, there's not one reference to St. Thomas Aquinas, who is the greatest teacher that we have in our history, or St. Augustine, or the different catechetical people in the history of the church. None of them are even talked about here. It's all about what's happened since Vatican II. How has Vatican II changed everything? And I think that's a fundamentally non-Catholic way of looking at it, because in Catholicism we have a whole tapestry of tradition that dates from the Old Testament, even before Christ, all the way to today. And we need to tap into that whole tapestry instead of just looking at, okay, what's happened after Vatican II. Okay, let's keep moving on. In paragraph 5, and I'll by the way, I'll link in the show notes to the document itself so you can read it. It's not very long, and you can decide for yourself what you think about it. In paragraph 5, Pope Francis then adds, without prejudice to the bishop's mission as the primary catechist in his diocese, one which he shares with his presbyterate, and to the particular responsibility of parents for the Christian formation of their children, I like that he added that, recognition should be given to those lay men and women who feel called by virtue of their baptism to cooperate in the work of catechesis. The problem is that he says, without prejudice to the bishop's mission as primary catechist in his diocese. The fact is the The huge growth in lay catechists has done exactly that. It has prejudiced us against the bishop's mission. How many dioceses would you say in practice the bishop is the actual primary catechist of the diocese? Now, I know some people are thinking that's a good thing in my diocese, but nonetheless, the idea that Catholics should be catechized first and foremost by their bishop, by the presbyterian, in other words, by their parish priest, and by parents. That should really be the three sources of our catechesis that we receive from others. Obviously, we should be doing some self-catechesis, reading the Bible, reading the catechism, Thomas Aquinas, things like that. But the point is that those are the three main things. The lay catechists are simply, they're kind of been inserted into that. Not to say that they don't have a role, but it frankly is a minor role compared to the other people. But yet, by instituting a ministry of catechesis, do we really think that's not going to further diminish the role of the bishop and the priest and the parents in the catechesis of our children? It probably will. Okay, so let's move along. Paragraph 7. This one has a number of things I wanted to talk about that I wanted to discuss. Oh boy, where do I start? Okay, so I think I'll go with, he's talking, he refers to St. Paul VI, Pope Paul VI, and how he instituted, basically how he's changed the ministry, the orders, and everything like that. But then he mentions also his one of his apostolic exhortations, where he said that in calling for a discernment of the present needs of the Christian community in faithful continuity with its origins, the Pope encouraged, this is Pope Francis talking, but talking about Pope Paul VI, the Pope encouraged the development of new forms of ministry for a renewed pastoral activity. Okay, I admit I had a trigger word in that, actually two instances of it. The word new. The word new is probably the favorite term used in Vatican papal documents in recent history, especially under Pope Francis. I think I calculated the word new in some form or renewed is used in some form, like I think 11 times in this very short document. And it's this idea of everything's new. We have the new evangelization. We have new forms of catechesis, new forms of ministry, a renewed pastoral activity. Everything is new, new, new. And again, when did it start being new? With Vatican II. But this is, again, the whole hermeneutic of rupture I'm talking about, that we go away from the past. We look at everything. It's like this idea that there's a line. In 1965, 62, whatever, whenever, either beginning or end of Vatican II, everything before is bad, everything after is good, new, renewed. And that really is not a Catholic way of looking at it. Now, I'm not saying this means that we completely reject everything in Vatican II and afterwards, and that we completely accept everything that was done, how it was done before Vatican II. No, the whole point is that we look at the entire tapestry of tradition, like I said before, and we bring it all together. We don't have this dividing line of before is old, before is bad, after is good. Old is bad, new is good. And so, but we see this very clearly in this document, talking about how since Vatican II, we've had renewal of ministry, renewal of catechesis, new thing, new this, new that, new evangelization. Okay, continue on paragraph 7. It says, we can indeed count on many lay persons, although still not nearly enough, who have a deeply rooted sense of community and great fidelity to the task of charity, catechesis, and the celebration of the faith. And here, Pope Francis is quoting himself in his document, Evangelii Gaudium, which was written a few years ago. And it's this idea, okay, we can count on many lay persons, although still not nearly enough. Maybe I'm reading too much in this. I will admit that. But it seems to me that we're trying to make every Catholic a parish worker, either a parish worker, a parish employee, or a parish volunteer. That everybody, in order to be a truly full, good lay Catholic, has to have some ministry inside a parish. Because really, when we're talking about lay ministry, catechesis, it's always going to be done in the context of a parish or a diocese, potentially in general. But what we're doing is this mentality that in order to be a good Catholic, you have to be a parish volunteer, parish worker. is really not the way it should be. I talked about this a good deal in my book, The Old Evangelization, and also in my book, Holiness for Everyone, not trying to just plug my books, but it's been a theme of a gripe, I guess we'll say, of mine for a long time. There's this it's a common myth that permeates a lot of parishes. Like the best Catholics are the ones who are the most involved in the parish, but that's not the way it has to be. For example, the stay-at-home mom who spends her days, she goes to mass on Sundays. Maybe she tries to go to mass during the week sometimes when she can, but she spends her days taking care of the home, taking care of her kids, homeschooling her kids. Or the dad who's at work all day, working maybe 10, 12 hours a day to support his family, comes home and maybe he's part of some various groups or something like that outside the home, but he's trying to take care of his family. He's trying to be a good husband, good father. Those are hardcore Catholics. They might not be involved in anything at their parish. It's not to say you can't be involved in some of your parish, but I really get the whole vibe from what Pope Francis is saying is the same vibe I get from in so many parishes, that in order to be a good Catholic, you have to be a good volunteer at the parish. And that's really not the case. And then Pope Francis goes on and he talks about that. There we go. It follows that the reception of a lay ministry such as that of catechist will emphasize even more the missionary commitment proper to every baptized person, a commitment that must, however, be carried out in a fully secular manner, avoiding any form of clericalization. Okay, one thing you can be sure of in when you read papal documents of recent years and Vatican documents, when they say we need to avoid this, that means that's exactly what they're doing. Because that's exactly what's happening here. It's the clericalization of the laity. What's the point of having a lay minister, a formal lay minister of catechesis, if you don't want to be clericalized them? That's exactly what you're doing. You're clericalizing them. Now, I know there's a distinction between a minister and cleric, but traditionally in Catholic thought, there's not really that much difference between the two. And so by making this formal ministry with a rite that to a lot of people might look like almost an ordination rite, who knows, they haven't developed the rite yet, that is clericalization. The idea that you have to be appointed by your bishop in a formal way, in a formal rite, in order to be useful, that's clericalization. The idea that lay people need to be more like clerics in order to be useful for the church. When again, like I said, the mom at home taking care of her kids and homeschooling them, or the dad at work, or whatever the case may be, those are fully forms of being Catholic, and they're not clericalized at all. But it's just a thing I've noticed, that whenever a church document in recent years warns against that, we're not saying this, that means that's exactly what they're saying. Okay, let's keep moving on. We're almost finished here. In paragraph 8, let me find paragraph 8. Where did I did not. Okay, highlight that one. Okay. The ministry has a definite vocational aspect. This ministry has a definite vocational aspect. Okay, first of all, I didn't highlight that, but I should have. A definite vocational aspect. Now we're talking a vocation. So we're talking a vocation to the ministry of catechetics. Now, most of us know when we talk about let's pray for vocations, the first thing most of us think about is the priesthood, vocation to priesthood. Yes, there are other vocations, for example, to the religious life. But again, that's something a little separate from the lay life. Like I get that religious people are still technically lay people, but there's a certain higher calling to that, a vocation to it. And now we're saying the ministry of catechetics is a vocation. It really diminishes the vocation to the priesthood by increasing the value of the vocation supposedly to the minister of catechetics. Okay, let me move on there. This ministry has a definite vocational aspect, as evidenced by the rite of institution. I mean, the Pope's just saying it's a kind of a pseudo ordination, and consequently calls for due discernment on the part of the bishop. It is, in fact, a stable form of service rendered to the local church in accordance with pastoral needs identified by the local ordinary, yet one carried out as a work of the laity is demanded by the very nature of the ministry. So I'm sorry, but I can't help but when I read this think it's another layer of bureaucracy. I mean, that's really what we're talking about. We have millions of Catholics leaving the church, millions of, we have so many troubles where bishops are not defending the faith, are not teaching the faith. Priests are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Yes, I know we have great priests as well, and we have a few good bishops. But in general, the house is collapsing, and Pope Francis and the Vatican seem to be wanting to create bureaucracies to surround that collapsing house. because that's all this is doing, is it's adding more layers to what should be we should be turning into a lean, mean machine as a church, because we're no longer that behemoth that existed in the Middle Ages and even post-Trent, that kind of strode across the world as we're the Catholic Church. You need to follow us. You need to listen to us. We had the right to say that for so long because that's what we were. But now, in the eyes of the world, we're a collapsing institution. And yes, I know that Christ promised that the church will never truly collapse, and I believe that wholeheartedly and firmly. It doesn't mean a lot of the surrounding aspects of it won't collapse. It doesn't mean we won't shrink into a very tiny church. After all, the entire church at one point existed with just the people in the upper room after the ascension of Christ. And so we had this collapsing institution, but yet we're going to create more layers of bureaucracy in it. It just doesn't make any sense. We should be becoming leaner. We should be encouraging lay people to do things like this, to have, podcasts or talk to their neighbors, to do things not on this formal basis. I mean, I think some of the best teachers of the faith, somebody like a Scott Hahn, he doesn't need to be a lay minister of catechesis in order to be one of the best teachers in the church today. And you could go other people like Jan Smith and all the work that she's done, Taylor Marshall, the work he's doing. We don't need this right of institution of the ministry of catechesis in order to have this done. In fact, I think it takes away from what their focus should be, which is actually just going out and teaching and preaching the gospel. Excuse me. Okay, and so then basically starting with paragraph 8 and 9, the Pope says, I established the lay ministry of catechist. The Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments will soon publish the rite of institution of the lay ministry of catechist. So they haven't instituted what the rite of institution is going to be. But again, what we're talking about is a kind of pseudo-ordination to the lay ministry of catechist. And so my question is, why? What was the purpose of this Motu Proprio? It's on the Pope's own initiative, so obviously he can do whatever he wants to do with the Motu Proprio. But typically, a Pope would be responding to the call from the people. So, for example, when Pope Benedict issued his Motu Proprio, liberalizing the traditional Latin, the saying of the traditional Latin Mass in the Church, that was something that there was a burning desire among many people for that to happen. But I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm not paying attention enough, but I don't know of some big demand that there be a lay ministry of catechetics. And how does this help catechesis? How does this in any way help catechesis? They talk about more formal training, but we know exactly what that's going to be. It's the exact same training that dioceses and parishes are giving now, which in some cases, they're hit or miss. We'll just say that. A lot of times more miss than hit. But the point is like, this doesn't really help evangelize the world. It doesn't really help catechize the members of the church in any way. What it really does is it's a subtle way of undermining the ordained ministries of the church, i.e. of the bishop, of the priests and deacons. It mixes, it does some gender confusion by having women now be another member of another ministry in the church, which just can be like, well, if a woman can be a minister of catechesis, why can't she be also a diaconal ministry? If she can be diaconal ministry, why can't she be the priestly ministry? She can be the priestly ministry, and we're the Episcopal Church. So I think there's a lot of issues with this. Now, I don't act like this Motu Proprio is some church, earthquake or anything like that. It probably will be mostly forgotten in most dioceses, but it just is another example of how we're avoiding the real problems in the church. I think that's what it comes down to. We're creating these bureaucratic structures. We're talking about these things like everything is great since Vatican II, when we all know everything isn't great. And so what I would say is just a note of hope at the end here I'd like to have is that catechesis is desperately needed in the church today. I mean, there's just no question about that. We all know there's been a crisis of catechesis since the 1970s, at least, maybe even before that, where Catholics grow up not knowing their faith. And I think it is tied into the crisis of evangelization, that we don't really give a reason to our Catholic children always why they should be Catholic. Not just what it means to be Catholic, that's catechesis, but why should you be Catholic? That's evangelization, because you want to have a lifelong relationship with Jesus Christ and the Catholic Church. You want to be his disciple, and you want to give your life to him. You want Christ to live in you and you die. That's why. But then how do you do that? Now we're talking catechesis. What are the teachings of the church? When Christ gave his great commission to the apostles, he said, go out and baptize and teach them all that I have commanded you, meaning teach them the deposit of faith, what it means to be Catholic. Well, you know who does that first and foremost? The primary educator is the parents. So that's the first way. Catholic parents, they don't need to be a lay minister of catechesis to do this. But then the priest and the bishops, they're the primary, I should say the secondary after the primary, the parents, way of teaching the faith. But there is a role for lay people. I'm not saying lay people should not be involved in catechesis. But again, I think our role as lay people is through non-bureaucratic means, non-structured ways. It's you talking to your neighbor. Somebody asks you a question on Facebook about the faith, and you answer it. Maybe you have a podcast or something like that. On social media, in real life, whatever the case may be, you're teaching others about the faith. You're learning it yourself. Maybe you're writing. Maybe you're writing blog articles or books or something like that. All these things don't need a pseudo-ordained lay ministry of catechists to happen. And in fact, that's the more natural way it happens. I mean, somebody like, for example, talking about a lay catechist before Vatican II, Frank Sheed, he's one of the probably the greatest English speaking, at least, lay catechists of the 20th century. And he wrote so much, and he would go to Hyde Park in England, and he would defend the faith against all comers. He didn't need to have a right of institution to do that. But so I think this is a much ado about nothing, this Motu Proprio. But all it really does, I mean, it just, like I said, it just adds layers to a crumbling structure. But unfortunately, there are layers on top of the crumbling structure, which just means it goes down quicker. Instead of building the base back up, the church leaders seem to be putting more layers on top of the crumbling structure. And so we need to stop doing that and start building from the ground up instead of from the top down. Okay, I think I'm going to end it there. Hopefully you got something out of this. I would say I encourage you to read this Motu Proprio. I will link to it, but I don't know if you really have to be honest, to get the general sense of what it says. But continue to teach the faith to your kids, to your friends and neighbors, and be a catechist in your life, in how you act and what you teach to others. But don't feel like you have a need to be a pseudo-ordained minister of catechesis. Okay, so until next time, I'll see you guys later.